Hello, my name is Alberto, and I will be your instructor in this Udemy course about the neoclassical growth model with that will comprehend both theory and an application to MATLAB. I am from Mexico, but I have lived in the US for 6 years, where I studied a PhD in economics in the University of Pennsylvania. I finished it a couple of months ago, and now I am back in Mexico, working on Mexico's central bank. I'm very happy about being your tutor or instructor in this course, and I am very passionate about economics, but also about teaching. So hopefully, this will reflect on my course and the way I teach it. And feel free to reach out if you have doubts about what I say or the material that we will cover. And speaking about that, let me talk briefly about the course that I will be teaching. As the title says, we will be discussing both the theory and the math computation and implementation of the neoclassical growth model. I will center exclusively on this model, but one of my objectives is for you not only to learn the foundations of this model and the technicalities of the model, but I also want you to learn why and when is this model useful, and why do we as economists make use of it in many different applications and many different situations. I also want you to learn some of the intuition behind the model and learn, very importantly, when can you use it and what are the limitations of the model and which scenarios wouldn't be ideal for you to think in a neoclassical growth model to explain whatever questions you're trying to answer. So that's going to be part of the course. And I want this course to be pretty much self-contained in the sense that I will be discussing the model from scratch, and I will assume that you have not seen or learned anything about the model. So I will start from scratch. The only thing you need to know before delving into this course is calculus, just because we're going to be using these more modern tools to approach the model. Also, it would be ideal if you already know some of the notions of equilibrium and general equilibrium, as well as some micro foundations such as consumer, what problem, utility maximization problem, and the profit maximization problem for firms. So if you had already taken an intermediate micro course, this is the natural next step. So that would be okay. And in terms of programming and MATLAB, I will also assume that you are not familiar at all with MATLAB. So I will teach you how to use it from scratch. However, it is important for you to be at least familiar with some aspects of programming. You don't need to be an expert in programming, but you do need to understand some aspects of programming. So, for example, what is an if, what is a for loop, what is a while loop, etc. So if you had some experience in programming, that would be ideal. But if not, I'll try to do my best to also teach you about that. So this course is going to comprehend several modules and several lectures. And after each lecture, I will give you some homework and problem sets to solve, just because I believe that one thing is listening to me, but another thing is you actually doing the problem to see if you understood and learned the material correctly. Okay, so I will be using these slides that you currently see on the screen, and these will be my main source of material. However, I will also be using whiteboards as secondary and tool as a secondary tool just to do the math. Because again, I'm gonna assume that you are not very familiar with this type of modeling, so I will be very careful in explaining all the math and all the technicalities behind everything that I'm doing. So that's the preview of the course, and now let's go into it. So, in terms of why are we studying this, the first thing we need to understand is what we mean by a model in macroeconomics. This is going to be a course focused on macroeconomics, which is trying to understand in general aggregate behavior, not the behavior of a particular individual or a particular firm, but at a country or a locality level, what's the behavior and what should we expect behavior to be like. So the first thing we need to agree on is what is a model. Of course, this is going to mean different things in different contexts, but again, I'm going to be focusing on macroeconomics just because that's the objective of the course. So in macro, whenever we say a model, we usually mean a framework that has the following ingredients. On the one hand, we're going to have households, or we're going to have agents or private individuals that are going to be living in this economy, and they are the ones that are going to be consuming, uh, and they're going to be also providing labor, and they're also going to be the ones that own capital and own everything in the economy. So these households are the main ingredient of most of the macroeconomic models. And the important thing here is that households are going to have preferences. They're going to prefer consuming one things over others. And this is the most important ingredient that they bring into the framework. Households have preferences over allocations of consumption. They prefer consuming usually more than less. And importantly, we usually assume that they seek to maximize these preferences, or sometimes these preferences are referred to as utility, subject to a budget constraint. And this budget constraint is going to be changing depending on the model that we study. And I'll be more specific on that as the course unfolds. But this is the main thing that households bring to the model as a framework. They have preferences, and they seek to maximize their preferences or utility, but they are constrained, and they have a budget. And usually the budget is of the form they cannot spend more than the income they have. And I'll be more specific on this, but this is usually the type of budget that we have in mind. On the other hand, households need to consume, but these consumption goods are usually not do not fall from the sky. They need to be produced. So the other side of the demand market, or the consumption market, sorry, are going to be firms. And firms, they're going to be the ones who provide the consumption good that households eat or consume. However, firms have a different objective than households. Firms, the thing they seek to do is to maximize their profits. And usually, there are going to be constraints on the firms that come from the side of how good or bad they are at producing this consumption good. So the important key that the firms bring to the model, or a macroeconomic model in general, is the production technology. And so how? is it that the firms, or in general the economy, transforms labor and other inputs such as capital, for example, into goods that people and private agents later consume. So how this is transformed, that's what firms bring to the table. On the other hand, we usually have the households, then we have the firms, and another very important ingredient, especially when we try to analyze policy, is the government. The government is an agent that is not a household, but it is also not a firm. And the government is going to try to instrument policies, okay, that in theory should help either households or firms. The government may have different objectives, but also the government is going to have constraints. Um, this, again, is an aspect that most macroeconomic models nowadays consider. In this course, however, because of one very strong result that I'm going to discuss in further lectures, the neoclassical growth model is not going to necessarily need a government in order for it to operate. I will be more specific about this, but I mean, I just wanted to let you know that a lot of macroeconomic models have governments in there, and the governments are entities that are not households nor firms. But at least in the model we will study in this course, we will not be dealing directly with a government. There's also other market participants. There are a lot of them, uh, but again, the neoclassical growth model is very stylized and and relatively simple, and there will be no other market participants in this model. Another thing that's very important, and the neoclassical growth model has very strong assumptions on this, and I will be more specific when we get to that, is information. What do I mean by this? What do agents know at the moment of choosing their decisions? That means, what do households know about the economy whenever they are deciding their consumption? What do firms know about the economy whenever they are deciding their labor and capital demand to produce? And in case there's a government, what does the government know whenever they're implementing choosing their policies? Information is very important in economics, and there's a lot of work showing that if we change who knows what, the results may of the model and the predictions of the model may be very different. So information is going to be a very key ingredient that you always have to underline whenever you are stating a model. And one last thing, and this is one of the key aspects that I will focus on the lectures that follows, is what is the equilibrium concept that you're handling. I will delve into this a lot in the upcoming lectures. But the only thing I will say here is equilibrium basically means defining how do households and firms and government and any participant in the economy interact with each other, and how allocations and how consumption, labor, capital is uh, allocated in the economy. This is going to be a very important part of the story, but again, I would leave it here, and I will assure you that in the upcoming lectures I will talk a lot about equilibrium. Now, before we start on the neoclassical growth model, I just want to give you this food for thought. And this is one of the usual critiques that people do to economists, which I believe is an unfair critique. And I will be more specific in a second. One of the things that you always need to ask yourself whenever you're trying to understand or set up a model is first, why are you doing this? What is the objective? What type of questions do you want to understand? If you're just writing a model for the sake of writing a model, you're probably doing it wrong, and that's not a good reason to write up a model. Usually, we as economists write models because we have questions in mind. For example, what drives economic growth? Or how do people decide when to save and when to consume? Things like these are very specific questions. And for those questions, sometimes writing a model may provide the right answer and sometimes not. So one of the things you need to ask yourself before starting writing a model is what do I want to answer? The next question is, okay, given my research question, which is the model that I should use to answer that question? Okay. Not every model is as useful to answer any question. Okay. So without being more specific about what's the objective that you want to understand or to analyze, any model will not be useful at all. Okay. The answer, which is the best model in general, that's kind of an answer that has a very simple answer, which is no, there's no model that is better than any model in general. Okay, uh, because models, and as you will see that in the neoclassical growth model, at least in this lecture, models are very tied to the type of questions that you want to answer. So it's not true that that there exists a model that will give you the answers to anything that you want. That's a, a thing that you need to understand very importantly. Now, there's another debate. Oh, well, before going to that, you can, and I already said this, you can only determine if a model is useful in the context of a question you want to answer. So sometimes there are some type of questions for which the model that you have in mind will be very useful. There are other questions for which the model you have in mind will not be useful. And you need to understand, in order to know if your model will be or not useful for this, you need to understand what are the main assumptions that you are doing in order to set up your model. At least in the neoclassical growth model, I will be very specific on which are the assumptions that we make, and if you believe those assumptions or not, that will lead you to try to answer whether using the neoclassical growth model is useful or not for your particular question. Now, there's this idea that complicating models, that means usually at classes and in universities or in mini lectures like this one, people that teach us usually teach very simple models, okay? And they usually add something like, well, if you want to complicate it, you can do it like this or like this. But they don't talk about that. And there's this idea that adding more things to a model is always good. Like for example, as I was saying in before, in the classical growth model we're only going to study a model in which there's households and firms but no government. And one would say, well, in reality, there are governments. So a better model would be to add a government because I think that there's governments around the world. And you may think that that's going to make your model better. And the answer is not necessarily, because there's a reason potentially why the neoclassical growth model doesn't need a government to function. And hence, adding a government will only complicate things, but will not give you any further insight on the implications of the model. And this is something that is very interesting to think. Not necessarily adding more complicated stuff makes your model better. And also, I am of the team that thinks that if a model is simpler and can help you to answer your question, that is better. Because sometimes, if you think about it, if we have very, very, very complicated models with a lot of equations, we kind of lose the intuition of what's going on. So that's my take on this. So I am of the team that it's not the case that adding more things to the model makes them better. It is very important that we introduce a new feature only if it is necessary in the light of the question we're trying to answer. Okay? So not always adding more things is better. And this is something that many people don't completely understand. And I hope, at least in the light of the neoclassical growth model, that I will be able to convince you that this is the case, that not always adding more things is going to help you answer things. And there's a very nice analogy that I like that I think makes my point very clear, which is models are like maps. And what do I mean by this? Well, think about it. There are different types of maps in the world or in out there. Like for example, there's Google Maps that is a very specific map that if you that gives you not only the streets but also tells you where are the restaurants, where are the cafes, where it's a very specific map. But Google Maps has a very specific objective, which is help you navigate over a city, right? But for example, there are other types of maps, such as the subway map. The subway map is a map that only has that tells you, well, the city is like this, there's a line that goes like this, etc. But the subway map doesn't have any specific on where are the streets. The subway map doesn't have any specific, it's not specific about where are the restaurants. The subway map actually many times is not even geographically correct, right? So it may be that the distance between station A and B is not exactly as shown in the map. But we as users don't care about this because the objective of using the subway map is not navigating through the city, it's just using the subway. So a very unfair critique to the subway map would be, well, the subway map is not useful because it doesn't tell me where my favorite restaurant is. Well, you shouldn't be using the subway map to find your favorite restaurant. So the problem is not on the map. The problem is on the user that wants to use the map for a reason it's not built to do. Well, the same is with the models. Models are sometimes useful for one things and useful and sometimes are not. So you as a user need to understand what and under which conditions you should be using a particular type of model. And is not, I believe it's not fair to criticize a model just because it doesn't allow you to answer every potential question. Again, the problem is not on the model, the problem is on you as a user. Exactly the same as in the subway map. The subway map has a lot of flaws if you if you analyze it as a general map. However, it is very useful if your objective is to navigate through the subway because the only information you need is which are the stops and where can you connect. That's it. So I like this analogy because it's perfect on trying to make the point on when it's useful to use a model or not. And again, I hope by the end of this lecture and this course, you understand when, under which situations, using the neoclassical growth model is correct and when it is not correct, and also how to solve it in MATLAB. So I hope you enjoy the course, and the following lectures will be on the neoclassical growth model.